In the future, people know about an even further future when time travel exists. From that future comes a man that tries to change his fate, but his younger self does not agree with the way he wants to change it. A man looks at his watch and sits in a field. Then another man appears there on fabric and gets instantly shot to his demise. The man who shot him, Joe, then narrates that time travel will be invented in 30 years and will be outlawed. We then see Kansas in 2044. Joe states to be a specialized assassin called a looper, an assassin from the present that's connected to a future employer. He explains that his employer from the future brings him his target and Joe gets paid in silver. He adds that when he disposes of the body, he is ridding someone that does not exist in the eyes of the government. Joe then goes to some place and places 2 silver bars to collect something. Afterward, he gets in his car and drives. He meets a man he calls Seth. As they ride together, Seth floats a coin in his hand. And then Joe narrates how 10% of the population has TK, the ability to make things float in the air. Seth is one such person. Then they enter a bar, and Joe comes to a man with TK. He tells Joe that someone just closed their loop. After that, Joe narrates some more, saying time travel is so illegal in the future that the employer might want to cut all ties with it, including the looper. So they will send the future version of the looper to get executed. He says this is called closing your loop, and gold bars get issued rather than silver. Then we see Joe taking care of more assignments while witnessing more people announcing their loops are closed. Later, Joe comes home and hears a knock on his window. He discovers it is Seth and lets him in. When inside, Seth panics if certain people are there. Joe asks him what happened, and Seth tells him he encountered his future self. He could not eliminate him because he knew who it was. He then tells Joe his future self told him there was a new boss in the future who is closing all the loops. He is called Rainmaker. Furthermore, Seth says he let his future self go. Joe then narrates that such things are called letting your loop run. He soon gets a knock on his door and checks who it is. Seth pleads to be hidden, and Joe hides him under the floor. Shortly after, he lets the people in. A man instantly comes in with a pointed gun and gives a quick inspection. Then they travel elsewhere while one of them stays in Joe's flat. At the other place, the man who brought him in knocks on a door, and they both wait. When the door opens, the man gets knocked with it, and Joe enters the room. While he sits inside, he narrates that the man he came to see, Abe, is from the future. He was sent back to this time to run the loopers. Then Abe tells Joe he is sure Seth came by his flat. But Joe acts confused, forcing Abe to talk for a little. He then tells Joe that he could either give up Seth or give them half of his silver bars. To this, Joe decides to reveal Seth's whereabouts. We then see future Seth running. He discovers burn marks on his arm that instruct him where to go. But he ignores them and starts climbing a fence. As he does, he notices his pinky is missing, and then his other fingers start disappearing too. After that, he drives a car and more parts of him start disappearing. When he exits the car, he can no longer walk. So he crawls on the ground to the location on his arm and knocks on the door. It opens and a gun fires at him. The man from earlier, Kid, is the one who shot him. He then drags him into the room. Later, we see Joe with a lady. He tells her about what he did. Then he offers to give her half of his silver bars. But she tells him she's doing fine. After that, Joe comes home and opens his floor door. He corrects one of his silver bars and notices some blood there. At his next assignment, Joe stands and checks the time. He notices it's somewhat late, and then a man appears without a bag over his head. Joe does not shoot him right away. Then when the man turns his back, Joe instantly fires at him. Gold bars fall out, and the man throws one of them at Joe. Then he quickly comes to him and knocks him out. Later, when Joe wakes up, he notices a note on himself stating to leave town. Then he gets an incoming call on a device, and he crushes it. Following that, he comes home and sees his place is a mess. Joe soon hears people coming and about to enter, so he hides. We see that it is Kid and another who enter. Kid starts taking out Joe's silver bars, and then hears a sound. Joe runs and pushes him into the hole. Then he shuts it and tells him to tell Abe that he will fix this. But Kid shoots through the floor, causing Joe to run out the window. He tries to climb down but falls. Then we see him at the job site again. And this time, he properly shoots his future self. Joe collects his silver bars, and a collection of the succeeding years of his life in Shanghai is then presented. During the 6th year, we see he starts getting low on money. In the 10th year, he resorts to criminal work. Then 25 years later, Joe marries a lady. And finally, in the 30th year, his house gets broken into and he gets captured. The next scene has him about to be sent back. But Joe handles the men and decides to use the time machine to his advantage. He enters it and gets sent back 30 years to that same spot where the situation repeats itself. But this time, we see the future Joe's narrative. He takes his past self's truck and visits a store for some supplies. Then near his past apartment, he sees himself getting ready to enter his place. Joe then comes to a man in a car and blasts him. He collects his weapons after that and observes his younger self fall from the window. Joe then fires at the man who was shooting at him 30 years ago and finally brings him down. Afterward, he takes his younger self away. After a while, young Joe awakens. He sees a train arrive and starts running. Then old Joe uses the number on his hand to print something, and shortly after, he notices burn marks on his arm telling him where to go. So he goes to a diner and meets his younger self. Young Joe tells him he can't let him walk away from the diner, and old Joe provokes him to do it. Then he explains to him how memories work when one travels back in time and affects the past. He also tells him that he knows he's going to meet his wife, who will save him. Furthermore, he tells young Joe how stupid and self-absorbed he is, and how his wife will clean him up. After that, we see that on the day Joe gets caught, his wife gets shot. Then he asks Joe if he heard of the Rainmaker. He tells him that he came out of nowhere and did everything alone. The first thing he started doing was closing all the loops. Afterward, he shows him a number and says it's identifying information on the Rainmaker, which he will use to find and destroy him. He also says he's going to save his wife, but young Joe tells him to show her picture to him, so he won't have to marry her and have a different life. Old Joe prevents him from seeing it, and Joe reaches for his gun. However, old Joe stops him and takes his gun away. What follows is the Looper crew arriving and old Joe starts shooting them. Then young Joe attempts to shoot at him, and more of the crew arrives to join him. But old Joe escapes from the backside and has the crew chase him. After he runs away, they turn on young Joe and want to collect him alive. But he manages to escape on a hovering device into the field. While flying through, he jumps off to stay hidden. After all that, we see a lady at her house. Eventually, she witnesses someone in her field. This prompts her to come out with a shotgun and yell out a threat to whoever is trespassing. Then we see Abe scolding Kid about his failure of catching the two Joes. He follows that by confiscating his gun and striking his hand. Then the lady hears something in her field. She gets her gun ready as someone approaches her. Joe sees this and comes to help her. It is then revealed that the person was just a beggar. Subsequently, Joe falls and the lady brings him to her porch. She tells him he's suffering from withdrawal. The next scene has old Joe hiding in a sewer. He tries to remember when he first met his wife, but could only recall being slapped by the lady Sarah. Eventually, though, he manages to remember it and becomes relieved. In the morning, Joe sits with his weapon, and Sarah comes to him and demands that he puts it down. He then shows her a map and asks if she can verify on it that it's her house. She says it is and asks why it's marked. Then she notices the number there and asks him how he got it. Without even giving him a chance to talk, she blasts him, and he falls into the barn. Sarah quickly comes to him and demands that he tells her who he is. When he starts explaining, she soon infers that he's a looper. Then he explains to her his whole situation. Afterward, Sarah summarizes back to him that someone is coming to her house to eliminate her son because they think he might be the Rainmaker. Then she asks him who he allowed to let free. Joe lies to her that it was just some guy. Next, he asks her if she knows what the numbers mean. Sarah tells him that half of it is her son's birthday, and the other half is the medical code of the hospital he was born in. Joe states that 3 babies were born in that hospital that day. One of them is the Rainmaker. We then see old Joe spying on a lady with her child as she enters a room. Following that, Sarah gets a knock on her door and comes to open it. An armed man is there that tells her he's just ticking houses off his lift. Sarah asks him what this is about, and he tells her he needs to come inside. When she lets him in, Joe hears them walking and talking, so he hides. The man tells her that he's looking for his father too, and shows her 2 pictures of old and young Joe. Then he asks about her son and his age. Sarah lies, telling him he's 10. Afterward, they sit in the living room while Joe hides behind the couch. Sarah's son then descends the stairs undetected and enters another room. Joe follows him there, and they later slightly open a ground door. While waiting, Joe tells him that his mother sold him to a panhandle group. Then he says he eliminated them, but could not save his mother. When the man leaves the house, both of them come out. We then see Kid watching old Joe on a monitor. Then young Joe comes to Sarah when she's alone, and they engage in intimacy. After that, he sees she has TK power. Then she tells him that the man he's on the lookout for is his loop. She adds that Joe lied to her. Sarah follows that by telling him a story about how she abandoned her son. In the morning, Joe comes down the stairs and sees that the man, Jesse, returned and holds a gun to Sarah's head. Joe tells him to let go of her, and he does. Then he tells him that his loop is coming here, so he doesn't have to take him. He even tries to make a deal with Jesse, but he still tells him to get in his truck. Meanwhile, old Joe breaks into the lady's place. All the small items then levitate in the house and the boy falls. Then even heavier items levitate, including Jesse. As that happens, Kid tases old Joe, knocking him out, and Sarah saves young Joe from an explosion inside the house. After all that, Joe realizes that Sarah's son is the Rainmaker. He calls him a TK freak, and Sarah cries, asking what if he grows up to do good with it. But Joe says that he doesn't and goes after him. When he comes to the boy hugs him, and when Sarah arrives, he tells her that either his gang or old Joe will be there soon. Due to that, he advises her to leave the area. Then we see Kid trying to bring old Joe to Abe. But he manages to escape and takes some guns to start firing. He keeps going and eliminates a lot of men. Then Kid awakens and sees the massacre Joe caused. Next, he realizes where he must go. Following that, old Joe comes to the young one and throws a gold bar near him. He follows that by saying he can go live his life now because he fixed everything. But young Joe doesn't want him to destroy Sarah's son, and so he starts firing at him. Suddenly, Kid appears on a hoverbike and knocks Joe down. When he starts coming back his way, Joe shoots the ground to create smoke. This allows him to obscure himself from Kid and then shoot him off when he's near. After that, though, old Joe is no longer there. Sarah and her son ride away and see old Joe ahead of them. Sarah accelerates the truck and the boy gets scared. He uses his extraordinary TK to make the truck flip. But the duo manages to survive that catastrophe and gets out. They run while Joe shoots at them, and soon Sarah falls. Then he gets ready to shoot him again, but the boy makes a huge shockwave that blows them away and even reaches Joe in his vehicle. Both Sarah and old Joe levitate, but after Sarah calms her son down and tells him she loves him, the boy drops them. He then calls her his mom. What happens next is old Joe coming to them, and young Joe seeing him shoot Sarah. He sees the future of the boy riding in a train and narrates how the bad path has lay before him. He also says how the path is a circle that goes around continuously, but he decides to change it by shooting himself. Consequently, old Joe disappears. Then Sarah's son comes to her and asks where Joe is. She tells him that he went away. In the end, Sarah finds many silver bars on the road from old Joe's car. Then she finds his pocket watch.